Hi, my name is Andy Kirk, and welcome to Season 1 of Explore Explain. This is a podcast and video series all about data visualization design. In each episode, I have conversations with designers and developers to explore in depth the hidden thinking behind their visualization projects. I'll be asking them to explain the what, the why, and the how of their design process. We have some great guests, some wonderful projects to learn about, so let's jump straight into today's episode. Kath, thanks so much for joining me on this episode. To begin with, can you briefly introduce yourself, who you are, where you work, and what you do, please?
Sure. So I'm a data scientist and I work for an organization called Nesta. Nesta is an independent charity that's based in London, and we focus on promoting innovation in 6 different areas. So I work within a team of data scientists, and I split my time across 2 of those areas. One is labour markets, and the other is creative industries.
Well, thank you so much for giving up your time today to have a chat about the backstory of a project you worked on titled Making Sense of Skills, a UK Skills Taxonomy. And this was published on Nesta's website in 2018. So to begin with, can you just give a brief description about what this project is, what the initial sense of its aims are?
Sure. So this is an article and it contains 3 data visualizations. The article is about the first open and data-driven skills taxonomy for the UK. And a skills taxonomy is just a way of grouping skills, so the skills that we need every day in our jobs. So some examples of skills are things like listening, management, data science, design, things like that. And the aim of the article was to raise awareness about the need for a national skills taxonomy for the UK, and then to showcase a couple of the potential applications. So, what you can do when you have a skills taxonomy.
To begin with, what triggered this work? Obviously, this is linked to a research study, but was this something that you knew from the outset you were going to work on as well, or was it something that emerged as an opportunity out of the research that was conducted?
Yeah, I would say the latter. So it emerged as an opportunity that came out of the research project. So the project came about because Nesta is part of a consortium of researchers who run a centre called the Economic Statistics Centre of Excellence, or ESCO. And ESCO is a research centre that looks at how we can improve the way that we measure the modern economy. Um, and it's funded by the Office for National Statistics here in the UK. And within the centre, the focus of Nesta was to investigate job adverts. So, could the information contained within job adverts be used to improve labour market information? So, the kind of central piece of that research project was building the skills taxonomy using job adverts. And then the article and visualization that we're talking about today, that was written to summarize that research and hopefully try and reach a broader audience with our research than what we would have done if we'd just have um, finished at publishing a discussion paper.
That's right, and these days there's a lot of pressure on academic studies to reach beyond just their peer science group or their peer groups academically with only papers, and so these kind of products are obviously wrapped up in this idea of impact and more outreach to reach a wider audience. In terms of the people involved in this project, you didn't work alone. Can you just elaborate a little on who you worked with, on the work itself, but also which other stakeholders may have existed? And I'm thinking about who were the cast and crew of people involved with whom you might have helped to research this work, subject matter experts, people who will ultimately say, good job, that's done, let's launch it.
So actually, it was a very small project in that respect. There was really just the 2 of us. So my colleague Jill Jumaleva created the skills taxonomy. She's another data scientist that I work with, and she's head of our open jobs data team that look at how we can improve labour market information here at Nesta. So I was overseeing that project, and I helped to edit the discussion paper that Jill wrote. Um, and so that meant that by the time I came to visualize the data and to write the article, um, I already had quite a good understanding of the kind of the method and the limitations and the results themselves. And I think that that really helped. and compared to a situation where you're using an external source of data and you may have to make lots of inquiries and just hope that people respond, and that can be quite a lengthy process. Whereas I think, I was able to start kind of one step ahead, if you like.
Right, and obviously having two pair of eyes on a project, on a problem is always very helpful. You get that critical
That's
friend.
right.
Um, and I guess you also, it sounds to me like you had fairly clear defined roles, so you weren't both trying to do the same thing. There was, in a sense, a division of expertise on the research and the data and the kind of taxonomy, and then I guess your role as the kind of communicator to kind of bring it to life. The other key people aspect of this is always the audience. We've talked about the need for this to reach perhaps a broader audience than just a research paper traditionally may do. Um, how would you classify the audience intention of this work, and how might that contrast with perhaps the normal audiences that you at Nesta reach? Is it the same? Did it overlap? Or are we looking to try and tap into a different kind of group of recipients?
So yeah, it's a really good question. So we release all our work on our website for free. So potentially the audience is anyone. And sometimes it can be difficult to know exactly who our audience will be. What other groups are interested in a skills taxonomy. And so what we did at the very bottom of the article is invited anyone who was interested just to get in touch, because we want to keep working on this topic and we want to collaborate with others. We don't want to do it alone. And so we did that, and we were really amazed by the number of inquiries that we had and the range of different organisations who got in touch with us. And I think broadly there's around four groups, if I that I can kind of break our audience into. First of all, you have tech-based startups. So startups, they may be wanting to disrupt the recruitment process and need a skills taxonomy. They may be wanting to help firms identify roles that are likely to be automated, or to help firms better assign staff to different tasks based on their skills. So they're interested in a skills taxonomy. The second group would be education providers, so like from universities to MOOC platforms, as well as those giving advice on education, like careers advisors, and charities who perhaps help people get back into work. The third group is, and probably the largest, is local and central government, particularly local government, because in the UK over the last couple of years, local authorities have gained more control over their adult retraining budgets. And so, in order to know where to kind of put their money, they need to know how the demand for different skills is changing kind of in their authority over time. And then the fourth and final group is probably international organizations like the UN, the OECD, and we were also contacted by a number of skills authorities in other countries who are facing this exact same issues. Perhaps they're building their own skills taxonomies at the moment. And we've had inquiries ranging from South Africa to Singapore to Canada and Australia. I think that's essentially our audience.
Well, that's fantastic. I mean, that strikes me as something that's perhaps a much more mature recognition of an audience that you are intending to reach than certainly I've encountered in lots of discussions with other people. Usually there's a bit of a guess, there's maybe a bit of a hope that we can reach these people, but having that clarity, albeit there are quite a few different mouths to feed there, but having that clarity just gives you so much help in trying to work out, is this going to suit their needs, is it going to work for what they require. So that's fantastic. Regarding the constraints that may have existed around the project, timescales, any kind of pressures that you were able to, well, that's in some respects caused you problems because there might have been a rush, but also sometimes help you with having boundaries, and just have to you make judgments because there's no more time left. What were the kind of factors around that existed in this?
Sure. So the project was published in, I think it was August 2018. And I think I worked on the data visualization in the article very much off and on, but for probably about 2.5 months. But like I said, I felt like I had this head start and that I already knew the data really well by the time I started working on the visualization. And I didn't by no means spend the whole 2 months just doing this. So at any one time, just like any other researcher, we may have up to a dozen projects on the go. So we're constantly switching between different projects. And new proposals may come along, or another project may be due for delivery. So things just get moved back and forth. So I don't think we had a specific date, but when it's ready to go, you just want to put it out there and move on to the next project, I guess.
Absolutely, and I think it's important to recognise that idea that you might have a start and an end deadline or target deadline. Doesn't mean that you've got all the time in between to work on it. Nesta has a very apparent style guide, I would imagine. How did that impact on your thinking here? And is it restrictive, or is it helpful to have some of that thinking already in place when it comes to things like colour choices, typeface choices?
Yeah, that's right. So the style guide is relatively new actually because our website was redone in, I think it was early 2018. So with that work came a style guide. And to be honest, I find it really helpful because it takes away certain choices, like what font you're going to use or the line spacing. And then it reduces some of your other choices, like color. But you've still got a lot of flexibility. And I guess what I'm trying to do is make sure that my work emulates the kind of feel of the Nesta website. So if you go to our site, you can see that there's a lot of white space, but there's highlights of very bright colours, and it's got quite overall. I think it's got quite an energetic feel to it. So I wanted to try and copy that, and so I've tried to do the same. Um, I think the only constraints I face in terms of colours, our primary palette, there are quite a few colours that are very close to each other. So we have a pink, an orange, a yellow, and there are no blues or greens in the primary palette. So we do though have a secondary palette, and so I drew on some colours from that. And then I think I may have darkened a couple of the colours slightly so that white text could sit on top of those colours.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting. I mean, we'll come on to some of the colour choices later, and especially about this very prominent heading asset that was created. The first word I wrote down was tutti fruitis. Now I don't know
Oh,
if
right.
I don't know if you've encountered tutti fruitis in the UK, but these are these
I haven't. Are they?
extreme sugary sweets that are kind of
Oh, right.
rounded rectangles that just look exactly like this piece does. So
Like
that
gumdrops, perhaps?
yeah, I mean that kind of energetic,
Mm.
that kind of sweet feeling is something that I did kind of pick up on this. We'll come on to detailed technology later on in terms of what you ended up using, but when you started this, did you have a clear sense of what technology options you were likely to go down the route of?
Technology in terms of the what I use to build the data visualization. Yeah, I mean, I tend to use D3 or WebGL via a library called 3JS. But 99% of the time it's just D3. Um, and so I kind of knew I was going to do that. 3JS is great when you want to show lots and lots and lots of data. And although our raw data set is really large, we've got 41 million job adverts, I was actually only going to show the taxonomy. And so I think there are 140 odd skill groups in the most detailed level of the taxonomy. So D3 can cope with that. So yeah, no, I was always going to use D3.
And how about sort of behind the scenes with any of the analysis, the number crunching, the kind of preparation of data? Did you use Excel? What's your usual workflow on that side?
So Jill did all the analysis, and so we work in Python, um, and we use a number of libraries there, things like Pandas, scikit-learn, Matplotlib for kind of generating basic charts to look at the results, uh, things like that.
One thing I neglected to ask was a key thing, which is the format. Now, obviously, Nesta is the platform here we're looking at is a website. Now, principally, was it aimed for desktop, laptop, and what's the relationship between the design choices that we see there versus how it might work and translate to a mobile version? And was there any chance this would have ever been for print as well? I'm thinking for any of the outputs in terms of articles in printed journals or publications, and also things like posters. I mean, was that something that you had to consider, or did you sort of say, no, this is just a digital output?
So this data visualization isn't responsive, and that's just because it was made a year and a half ago, and at the time, I didn't have the skills to make a responsive data visualization. Um, I do now, and so all my data visualizations since then have been responsive. But if I was going to make this data visualization responsive or make it even mobile first, I would have designed it very differently. So you just can't show a full taxonomy on the space of a mobile. So I think what I would do is perhaps show the first layer of the taxonomy, and then some of to and then I'd give examples of some of the skill groups that live in each part of the taxonomy, but I would design it differently, I think. Um, it was always going to be a kind of digital output. So we do still publish quite a few reports, uh, though in our team it tends to be more a combination of research and discussion papers that perhaps go on to get published in journals, and then articles like this combined with data visualizations. Um, we have turned it into a poster. So there was a conference, I think it was run by ESCO, and yeah, we turned it into a poster for that. But that's quite easy to do with screenshots and things these days.
Okay, we're now going to move on to the next section of the design process, which is to consider the challenge of working with data. So obviously there's a very detailed research paper that talks about the intricacies of the calculations that were conducted by I guess in this case Jill, to arrive at the findings that we see in the visualization. Can you just summarise where possible the process of gathering the data, analysing it, and any particular observations about the characteristics that cause problems, any outlier data values, any big or small things that you knew at this point would be a difficult thing to handle when it came to the design stage later?
Yeah, so the job adverts that we used for the project were provided by a company called Burning Glass Technologies, and they collect job adverts. Um, The dataset contained 41 million job adverts, and they'd been collected between 2012 and 2017. And within each job advert, we were interested really just in three variables. So the title of the job, the skills contained within the description of the job advert, like listening, problem solving, management, things like that, and any salary that may have been mentioned in the job advert as well. And just on skills, so there are 10,500 unique skills or terms that have been extracted from these job adverts. And then what Jill did was her task was really to take those skills and group them, and to do that based on what skills tend to co-occur within job adverts. And so she did that using a couple of different types of machine learning. Um, the first was an approach she used called word embeddings, and that helps you to identify skills that are similar to each other based on the context in which they're used, and they give you a numerical representation of every term. Then she used community detection algorithms to group those terms into skill clusters based on those numerical representations or vectors. And then finally, she used a combination of bootstrapping and consensus clustering, which is you just use to ensure that the clusters or the communities that you found are stable. And that was how the taxonomy was built. So the final taxonomy has three layers to it. There are six broad groups of skills in the first layer. They split into, I think, 35 slightly more detailed skill groups. And then they in turn split into 143 skill groups. And each of the 10,500 terms or kind of raw skills, each of those live in one of those 143 groups in the third level of the taxonomy.
Wow, so I mean, first of all, I'm delighted that there was an automation process to assist with this task. It sounds like something that if you had to do by hand and eye judgment would be a life's work.
Well, that's a really interesting point because so there are other skill taxonomies already in existence. So there's one in the US called ONET, and there's one in Europe called the European Skills, Competencies and Occupations Framework. And they're what we call expert-derived taxonomies. So they were created, as you say, by experts getting together and describing the skills that are needed in different jobs. And that's a great way to build a taxonomy. There's nothing wrong with that. Um, but one of the advantages of using a data-driven approach is that, first of all, you're using the same language that employers use. So the way in which employers describe skills and how they kind of name them, we're using those same terms to create our skills taxonomy. Um, and the other advantage is that once you've developed this methodology, then you can keep running it and you can keep updating it. So skills we know are constantly changing, new skills are emerging, other skills are becoming redundant. And so by having this methodology that Jill developed, we can help to automatically surface new skills as well.
And I think something that's kind of wider than the aims of this project, but there's clearly some reproducibility that then gives. So it strikes me that this is something that could then be repeated in a decade time to compare and contrast with what's changed over that period of time. You could go back further than just 2012 to see how it's evolved and changed, since the turn of the millennia, since we've got these job adverts in digital form. You could also take it across into different countries and compare and contrast there.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So uh, there were kind of two broader reasons that we wanted to build a skills taxonomy. The first is that the UK is still facing very low growth in productivity. So productivity growth collapsed at the point of the financial crisis and still hasn't recovered. And part of the low growth in productivity has been blamed on skill mismatches. So that's where the skills that employers need don't match the skills that employees and job seekers have. So then it's really important that we have a way of measuring skill demands and skill supplies. And to do that, we need a way or a taxonomy, ontology framework, a way of kind of describing skills in a standard way. So that's one reason, to help address the productivity crisis. Um, the other reason was that we've got a kind of a series of long-term or kind of structural factors that are affecting the labour market, both in the UK and abroad. And those are things like the ageing population, climate change, automation, and they're changing the jobs that are available and they're changing the nature of jobs, like this, the tasks and the skills required in each job. Um, and so, if people are faced with the risk of automation, then it's really important that we can suggest what are termed desirable and feasible transitions to those workers and show them here's a job that's close to yours. It requires quite similar skills, but has a lower risk of automation. And we can only do that when we map out the jobs and tasks that are required, the skills and tasks that are required in different jobs. So those are the two reasons that kind of led to or what we felt is the need for a national skills taxonomy.
Absolutely, and as you say, it kind of gives you that baseline um, construct to ask more questions about how this might change. I was just going back to the point of the data collection method or the data handling method. To what extent? So clearly, this can never be perfect. It just is not something that's attainable. But other than the inevitable shortcomings or even slight shortcomings that could come from any automated method, were there any other headline caveats or uncertainties that had to be accompanied with this work? So I'm just thinking, for example, if there were any job adverts in the UK but that weren't in English, because they were to reach different populations within the UK. Were there any standout gaps that you always had to make sure were clearly labelled that this thing could not address?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So um, we love to explore kind of novel and new data sets, but with that comes huge uncertainties. And in the case, in this study, there's lots of uncertainty. Um, so there's two main types, and the first is that job job adverts will often never contain all the skills that you need for your job. So we may be missing some skills. They're unlikely to be, an exhaustive description of every skill that you need. The other key limitation is that not all work is advertised via job adverts and via online job adverts. So work can be awarded via tender, via audition, or work may be given out kind of casually and never advertised online. So we are not going to be this is not like an exhaustive collection of every single skill required for every job. This is more a sense of what you can do with a data set like job adverts. Um, but there are these real limitations. And so, where our thinking is currently is that the best approach is probably a combination of methods. So, that we could start with an expert-derived taxonomy like ONET, and then use a data source like job adverts to enrich it and to deepen the taxonomy. And it may also be a way to identify new skills. So, yeah, um, we're not saying that this is anyway the definitive taxonomy. This is very much the first attempt, and no one has, up until now, at least in the UK, no one had previously attempted to estimate the value of different skills. And in part because of that uncertainty, we were very careful in the data visualizations to show very few numbers. You can see there aren't many numbers mentioned, and that's because we didn't want people to get hung up over whether the rate at which a skill is growing is 1.2% or 1.3%, because we think there's so much uncertainty, those kind of distinctions just don't matter. Um, so those are the big two limitations, that we don't identify all skills within job adverts, and not all work is awarded via job adverts. But then there are lots of interesting like little limitations as well. Job adverts are really messy, and collecting them is difficult. So you can have situations, or we found situations, whereby two job adverts had been merged. And so when you look at the list of skills that had been extracted from the job advert, they looked a bit odd. They looked like a very odd mix of skills, and that's what had happened then. You can also have situations whereby the same word in English has two different definitions. So you may be a Windows developer or a cleaner of windows. Right? Same word, but very different definitions. But that's really important, because if you're taking the job title and you're hoping to assign it into an occupation group, and you're just doing that on a rule-based, a crude kind of rule-based method, then, and you've got one rule for the word Windows and what occupation group it slots into, then you're going to get into trouble there. And also, we have issues with acronyms. So um, if you were to turn all your skills into lowercase, all the words, then you may need to have knowledge of GPS, or you may need to work with GPs, right? And it's the same
Right.
term. Also,
Yeah.
CPR is another one that has multiple meanings. So we were able to kind of get around some of those limitations. So certain acronyms were removed. We were able to spot some job adverts that had been merged, and there were certain skills that were just troublesome. So they were words that had been mentioned on the web page, perhaps a term like JavaScript, or communication, as in, please get in touch with us if you have further questions. Um, and they weren't really skills that were being required in the job advert, so we were able to remove those as well.
That's interesting. And I mean, first of all, the thing that jumps out there is the complexity of labelling what we do, data visualization. You've got Z spellings, you've got data viz, all these kind of
Yes.
different things. But also the fact that a lot of academic studies are, in some part, not so much about the finding, but about the methods and about testing out a method, and sort of setting, as you said there, setting in place a whole new approach to do this that others can then build on, replicate, tweak, and perhaps apply to very different contexts
Yeah,
as well.
absolutely. It's a really good point. And I think in that sense, the visualizations almost become like illustrative, because
Mm.
it's showing the potential of what you could do with more work, with more job adverts, refining the methodology. This is where we could get to. These are the types of statistics that we might be able to kind of publish on a regular basis.
What was missing in the end piece that could have been in there? What did you eventually decide not to include that was maybe up until the last moment still being in there, but ultimately was kind of rejected? I'm thinking specifically about Killing Your Darlings, which is always a very difficult thing to do.
Actually, the reverse happened. So initially, I was just going to show the taxonomy, and then I thought perhaps I'll show one chart comparing the value of skills with the growth and demand. And then we saw the uncertainty around salaries. Not so much the uncertainty, but the variation, one type of uncertainty, I guess. So then we said, well, actually, let's show that separately. Let's have one chart just about the value of different skills, and then let's have a third chart combining salaries with growth and demand. So actually, if anything, it grew rather than the opposite. But there were so many different potential applications that we could show. So we could have looked at things like the qualifications that are mentioned within job adverts and how they connect to skills. And another aspect or angle that we considered were looking at regional skill demands and how they vary across the UK. But I think both with qualifications and with regional skills, they're both quite UK centric. And so we did wonder whether that would kind of reduce interest in the piece. A little bit, and actually, we've gone on to do another project. I've almost finished it about um, workers' skills vary across the UK, and so that's turned into another piece of research.
Yeah, I mean, if we just sort of describe in brief terms the main chart contents aside from the text content, we've got a hierarchical display, we've got a comparison of range of salaries, and then we've got a final display which is more of a relational plot. And I think what is striking, not that it should have been there, but we don't have any analysis relating to a temporal dimension, and also we don't have any of the where. So it's interesting that they might have been available in the data, but ultimately you chose not to pursue that, which is, I think, a key part of all this. Just because you
Yeah.
have it doesn't mean to say you should use it.
No, and we just wanted to keep it as basic as possible because um, I guess there is a temporal dimension in the sense that we're looking at growth and demand over time, but we're not looking at it, you're right, we're not looking at it year by year. And in terms of the geographic angle, um, if we did introduce that, then we'd also have to talk about the uncertainties around that as well, because the location that is associated with the job advert, it may be the head office, it may not be where the job is actually based. So there are other limitations then that come into play that we'd need to talk about, and I think it would just kind of perhaps overcomplicate things. So we really wanted to keep it basic at this very initial stage.
Working through the actual visualizations that were constructed, the first thing I want to talk about isn't a visualization, but it's the first thing that you encounter, which is this asset of this big heading space, this title. Now, one of the things that always strikes me about your work, Kath, perhaps your signature piece, is how cleverly, how astutely, how sometimes audaciously you use the title space.
Oh, that's very
And,
nice.
I've
Thank you.
spoken in the past in some of my little viz pieces about the kind of integration of those to also show a chart within them as well. Um, the feature that we see at the top of the page is a very kind of artistic asset, an abstract asset. It's not a literal chart, it's not data driven, but what is that? And why did you pick to use that as your centerpiece starting point?
Yeah, there are a couple of reasons. It's quite funny actually because in some ways it came because of the constraints we face, and that um, as a data scientist, I can draw. I do enjoy drawing, but I don't have those illustration skills. I'm not an animator. We don't have photographers, but you've got to put something at the top of the page. And so sometimes that's why I use that kind of banner at the top to kind of show the key result. Or sometimes like this, it's just to draw in people's attention because I know the concern that Jill and I always had with this piece was, well, we kept saying to each other, it's a skills taxonomy. This isn't a front page story. Are people really going to read this? Is this interesting? Of course, by this point, we've been working on job adverts for quite a while now. We're really interested in it. But the concern is always, as a researcher, that others won't be. So I did want to make something that was deliberately very kind of bright and bold, just in the hope that it might kind of draw a few more people in. In terms of what it is, it's actually a blown up version of the third chart. So I took the third chart and then just blew up the shapes until they started to lay on top of each other. So it was actually something that was done very quickly, I hate to admit.
No, I mean, it's a very compelling sort of signpost to the kind of artistic direction you see elsewhere. So clearly, yeah, it does echo the third piece. And did it also exist as perhaps a title page that you would then use for, I don't know, presentations and slideshows about this?
Actually, that's true. That's exactly what's happened. That I do now use it as the title slide when I talk about the skills taxonomy, and I think Jill does the same. So no, it's come in quite handy, to be honest. Um, yeah, I think it is nice to give people a sense, I guess, of what's to come, and I've done that in other data visualizations too recently. Um, so yeah.
And I think as well, and it's not that we should just be putting jazzy, glitzy things for the sake of it, but there is something
No.
about the fact that you have to set up this topic with a fair bit of text in the intro, few scrolls down the page.
Yeah.
So I think when you do look at the kind of overall visual balance of the single strip PNG that you can do as a screen grab, it brings a certain balance, I think, to it, and so a certain gravity to that starting point. But moving on to the charts. So the first content that we see in terms of charts is a dendrogram,
That's right.
a linear dendrogram. So although, because you're an experienced visualization developer, data scientist, this might have been something that was already quite clear in your mind about what you might pursue to show this data. To begin with, were there any other charts that you considered?
Yeah, so I looked at lots of different possible charts online, and I guess the one thing I was really certain about was that I wanted to show the taxonomy fully expanded. So lots of the examples I found online were whereby it was more interactive and the taxonomy was collapsed, and then you would click on each node and it would expand the next node and show you a bit more of the taxonomy. But personally, I found that kind of frustrating that you would have to click so many times to just see the whole thing. So I was certain from the start that I wanted to show the whole thing fully expanded. I did consider then something like a circular dendrogram, just because they look quite nice. But sometimes it is nice to have something that looks a bit different and is kind of you think will catch someone's eye, but it just wasn't practical because I really don't like it when you're having to kind of tilt your head 180 degrees or whatever to try and read a label. Um, so that really ruled out that. And as you can see, lots of the labels are quite long. And so if I had have used the circular dendrogram, the actual centre of the dendrogram where you see the structure, it just would have been so small, it would have been very hard to see anything. So that's where I kind of how I kind of came to the choices that I did. Um, I wanted to use, I guess, curves and to curve the text just to reflect because in kind of Nesta's own design, we have kind of those similar shapes. I also wanted the taxonomy not just to be um, just a taxonomy. So I wanted people to be able to get something else from it as well. So that's why I kind of tacked on a bar chart at the end so that you could see an indication of which skill groups are mentioned most frequently within job adverts. And then in terms of the other kind of features, um, like I mentioned before, attaching mouse over events to these little kind of invisible rectangles that sit behind each part of the taxonomy, um, so that yeah, when you hover over one part, all the labels come up. Um, and then I wanted to also, there's a little search box at the top, so you can type in your job title, and it will show you the skills that are most closely associated with your job, and it will grey out the skills that aren't required.
Interesting. Just on that little search box, obviously because this is your role, data scientist was the suggested
Yes.
search criteria. Um, One of the things I think is you spoke about before. You didn't want to give people too many clicks, too many
That's
tasks
right.
to undertake, and I think that's something that means that the linear dendrogram is certainly the best option, not only for the space that you're perhaps restricted with. A radial dendrogram would take up a lot of space. I think that tends to work better with print, especially because then you can rotate the piece of paper and kind of
That's
work
true.
around it. I love the curved paths of the labels. That's something that works so elegantly to make the labels look like they're actually part of it rather than just some bolt-on
Yeah.
apparatus.
And just a very small point on that. If you zoom in a little bit, what I found is that some of my labels were so long that they were starting to hit the lines of the dendrogram. So actually, every label is there twice. Once it's there in that kind of purpley kind of text color that I've used, but then behind it is the same label again, but in white with a slightly broader or larger stroke around it, just so that the labels stand out, so that they're never kind of a hit by the lines of the dendrogram too.
Interesting. So it's not that you've got a stroke or an outline of the text digits. It's actually like a shadow or a ghost behind it that kind of gives you that kind of overlay. That's very
Yeah,
clever.
you can see it in the third chart as well. I've done the same thing, just so that the text pops a bit from the shapes behind it.
Obviously, you mentioned the bar chart, and that works really well as a further element of detail and information. And I guess did you try out sized circles at the kind of end of those nodes? I mean, it seems to me that they would lose a certain amount of detail and also mess up the space and the arrangement.
Exactly, and I did try that, and mm, but you'll go. I think the bar chart. Uh, how do I describe this? So I think the bar chart perhaps is slightly better because it sticks. You kind of keep that horizontal kind of movement. Whereas with if I was to use circles, I think they would overlap each other. Um, and also most of them would be incredibly small. I don't think you'd be able to you perhaps see them. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's the right choice. Absolutely.
Oh, thanks.
Just with regards to the space again, of course, the page layout, I'm guessing is something around 1,000 pixels wide ish, give or take.
I think
Um,
so.
this is obviously a chart that exceeds the height of most screens. Was that something that you just realised you would have to do, and people would just have to accept there's a degree of scrolling and moving up and down, or were you spending time trying to find a way to fit it in the height of of a typical screen, shall we say?
That's really interesting because I think when I first started creating data visualizations, I felt like everything had to be on the one screen and you had to be able to see everything at once. But I think that's really changed, at least from the sense I get it looking at other kind of data visualizations, is that now people are much more willing to scroll, be it a scrolling data viz or just something like this that's kind of quite large. Um, so no, if anything, I think my data visualizations are getting longer.
I think you're right. I think that is the scrollability of, or maybe the swipeability of tablets and mobiles. I think has changed that, whereby we are now just going vertical.
I hope so.
I think in a sense you could say, well, why aren't we also going horizontal? But I think that's far less common to encounter.
Mhm.
Um, with regards to the colours, so obviously you mentioned that these are derived from the house style as such. Was there any reasoning why, for example, IT was allocated the sort of cyan colour, or any associated reason, or was it just say, look, give them all a unique colour? I think we've got six
That's right.
distinct categorical colours, and then just make sure that that's consistent throughout.
Yeah, I have to say, unfortunately, there wasn't anything as deep as thinking IT should be represented by that kind of aqua cyan color. No, I really just wanted to make sure that none of no single color dominated another color, that they kind of balanced or sat well with each other. But beyond that, no, I really didn't mind which color was associated with which kind of broader skill group.
But one of the things that is obvious in terms of a spatial management thing, and going back to interactivity, clearly all the labels at the very right hand side of the bar charts couldn't be shown together because it just gets too cluttered.
Yeah,
What was
that's
the kind of
right.
cut off, or the criteria that handles what is shown at any given point versus which then pops up when you do hover over those?
So I just wanted to show enough so that someone could get a kind of a sense of the skills in each group, but just to kind of get a rough idea. But no one is going to read all through 100 and whatever labels. So I really just wanted to give people enough labels to get a sense, and so that they could quickly scan down and see what the largest skill groups were, or the skills that are mentioned most frequently in job adverts. Um, if you hover over any one group, then all the labels in that group appear. And I think if I was doing it again, well, firstly, I would add in a few more annotations to guide the reader, but then I'd almost be tempted to make it fractionally longer so that those labels in the third layer aren't as squished. I think they're perhaps slightly squished,
Yeah,
looking back
yeah.
at
I
it
mean,
now.
I can read them fine, but obviously, when you think about accessibility to audiences, then you can probably say, well, maybe there's a lower threshold for what the font size should be that's smallest, and that becomes another factor that you have to work around spatially. But no, I think it's it's all about compromises, and this feels to me like the harmony is being found right. Moving on to the second key chart that we have, which looks at a different perspective, because this is looking at a sense of the range of salaries, and I wondered. Obviously, this is the second because it does feel that the taxonomy is the central story. But I wonder if there was any temptation to move this up the page, because salaries are always compelling to look at. It's the first thing that we always ask: how much do you get paid? How much do you get paid? So we've got this perhaps a range plot or a floating bar chart, however you want to term it. I think you mentioned as well this was perhaps something that you realised could have been interesting to add perhaps later in the process. Can you sort of talk us through the thinking of this chart?
Sure. So, yeah, if you can't see it, there's one row for each skill, and these are the skills that make up that third layer in the taxonomy. And for each skill, the median salary that is associated with that skill is marked out by a little white circle. So that's the median salary amongst all the job adverts that also mention that skill, a skill that lives in that cluster or that part of the taxonomy. And then to show the interquartile range, I've just used the solid rectangle of colour. And the skills within and across each group are ordered by their median salaries. And that was just so hopefully you could quickly get a sense of what skills are associated with higher salaries and what skills are associated with lower salaries. And I also wanted to highlight the skills that are more frequently mentioned in job adverts, just like I did with the bar chart in the first data viz. So to mark out those more frequently requested skill groups, they're kind of shown with a slightly larger circle, and I've also put the name of the skill group and the median salary there. And then to see the salary values or the labels associated with any of the other skill groups, you can just hover over them and all the labels in that skill cluster appear. Um, so yeah, no, that's the second data viz.
So in a sense, we're looking at in some respect the box of the box and whisker plot.
That's right.
And I guess part of that is to handle the removal of the outliers at each extreme end. Did you ever think about putting the full range on, or was it clear from the data that you were seeing that would have skewed it too much?
It would have skewed it too much, because what you see in job adverts is that occasionally there will be £1 million job, or there will be a job with a salary of zero. Also, only about 60% or so of job adverts contain a salary. So there is huge uncertainty around this. And that's why we wanted to show, even by the interquartile range, just how much variation there is. And we didn't want to get too hung up over particular numbers. But yeah, if we showed the whole range, it would just be a solid bar of colour going down the page.
And I think that's important, because you've obviously made a choice at this in this chart to present things at a summarised, aggregated level. I suppose another treatment for this chart would be a more detailed dot plot. You've got every little mark for all the different data values. You can kind of see the kind of shape as well from above. Did you explore that alternative? Are there any other charts that you could have used to show this? I don't think there are many that can do this kind of job of range.
Yeah. I don't think so because we definitely couldn't have shown all the individual dots just because D3 I don't think would have coped with it, or your the web page would have crashed on you, and I don't want to do that to people. So no, I'm trying to think. I think one of the changes I made towards the end, actually, that I just kind of came to mind now, was that initially I had little white strips between each row.
I was going to ask about the vertical sizing, yeah, because again,
And
there must be a
yeah,
little tweaking that's gone on. And you thought, right, that's it.
I went back and forth on because I think initially they weren't solid rectangles. They may have just been lines, I think. And then what I was finding is that when I was looking at it, it was very hard to quickly see the little white dots and the kind of the way they kind of flow like that. And so that's why I got rid of the spaces in between each row to get rid of that white space, and it stopped that kind of interference with seeing the little white circles.
And I'm thinking about the colours, obviously, which preserve that the categorical association from the previous chart.
That's really important, I think.
Yeah, clearly. And once you've learnt it once, you then get a sense of where you're looking.
Yeah.
Were you ever considering using variation in the colour lightness or darkness of those bars to show another dimension of the data? Just, I mean, obviously it's available as a thing to pursue. Doesn't mean to say you would have used it, but was that ever a consideration?
I don't think it was. I've definitely actually in the data visualization that I've just finished that I mentioned before, that one that's looking at what skills do workers in different regions have, I'm also showing a distribution. And there I'm using exactly that approach. So I'm not just showing the interquartile range, I'm showing kind of deciles. And each decile, just as you describe, has a kind of a slightly different um, kind of tone to the color. Um, or lightness, sorry, not tone.
Mm.
Um, and so I've used it there, but no, I didn't use it here. But you're right, I could have done it, and perhaps that may have helped, because then you'd see, I guess, a bit more
You
detail.
don't want to
Yeah.
burden the audience with too much to try and pass, I guess. But I think it works well as it is. Yeah.
Sometimes people do struggle, things like deciles, they can be a bit tricky to wrap your head around sometimes.
And also just obviously little design features are things I'm obsessed with. I'm seeing that the label for the cluster, so for example, information technology, is sort of 2 or 3 lines down. Did that begin at the top and then you had to
Yes,
nudge it down to stop the overlaps?
it did. You're absolutely right.
Right.
And looking at it now, I think I could have even moved it to halfway, perhaps. Um,
I mean, I guess there is potential because one of the things that
yeah.
strikes me, there's a nice balance to the number of skills within the clusters, and I think it's quite a favourable shape of data to work with. So doing things like that, I guess, wouldn't be the worst treatment, but I think it works fine. I think it almost makes sense to introduce it when you've encountered it reading down. Um, the last thing I want to mention about this chart, which is something that I really like, and I think it's something that too few people are almost kind of courageous enough to do, which is stripping back the chart apparatus to not include grid lines, to not include axis labels, axis tick marks, all the things that you see by default in Excel charts,
Yes.
and you've reduced it down to just simply low up to high. Is that something that's your own personal style that you like to do, or was it just a sense that we don't care about reading off exact values, it's about the sense of shape?
I think it's a combination of the two. I do like quite a kind of minimalistic style, um, but I also didn't want people to get too hung up on individual values, because we know there's so much uncertainty around these numbers. So it was to give a sense of here's a type of statistics that we could show with this data. Um, but don't expect that if you have the skill, you will be paid exactly the salary.
That's right. I think that's really important again about the uncertainty that you mentioned there, because sometimes when we portray things in very precise detail forms, it kind of implies precision where it
Yes.
does not exist. So I think this idea of just get a sense of the data is absolutely the right level to pitch it at.
Yeah, it's a really important point because, at least in this case and in quite a few of my other data visualizations, the most important uncertainty is a type of uncertainty that can't be measured. So then what becomes really important is not showing it in the chart because you can't, but discussing it in the text and critically discussing it in a way that doesn't presuppose any knowledge of machine learning or data science. So when we discuss the uncertainty, I'm not talking about individual parameter choices that no one has ever heard of. I'm talking about it in terms that everyone would understand and could kind of sympathize with.
Absolutely. Okay, we move on to the final chart,
Yeah.
which is wild. There is so much going on with this one. It's fascinating. So, could you describe it in layman's terms? It strikes me as it's a derivative of a scatter plot, perhaps more of a
That's right.
sort of proportional symbol plot, as it were. But yeah, what's the kind of thrust of this piece?
Yeah, so this is the third and final chart, and it ranks each skill cluster by two variables. So along the horizontal axes, the skill clusters are ranked by their growth and demand over the last few years. And on the vertical axis, they're ranked by the median salary for that skill group, which we showed previously. And then the skill clusters themselves are represented by rectangles with slightly curved edges, and the size of the rectangle represents the total demand for that skill, which was shown alongside the first chart, the dendrogram. So the skill clusters here in the top right-hand corner, they're skill clusters that both have relatively high salaries and high growth, and they include the likes of data engineering, IT security implementation, IT security operations, marketing research, app and web development. And what those skill groups have in common that we've noticed is that they're all quite reliant on relatively new types of digital skills. So that may be why they're paid relatively more and they appear to be kind of growing in demand. And then in the opposite corner, so in the lower left-hand corner of the chart, we've got skill clusters with lower salaries and lower growth compared to others. And what's interesting here is that many of the skill clusters in this corner, they involve working with digital technology in a kind of routine way. So using digital technology for kind of administrative purposes. We see kind of shipping and warehouse operations, medical coding and administration, web content management. Um, and that finding is actually consistent with other work we've done, which shows that um, if we look at the occupations that are most at risk of automation, some of them do involve working with digital technology for using digital technology for administrative purposes. So not using it to solve new problems or using it in a creative way. And that was one of our big findings in another study, that it's not just sufficient to recommend that everyone acquires new digital skills. It's the type of digital skills is really important and what you're using those skills to achieve. So that's broadly the, the third chart. And again, there's a little a search box at the top, so you can find kind of skill groups that matter for you. Yeah.
Yeah, and so one of the questions I had about this, I mean, there's lots of little features that strike me as being very kind of intricate. First of all, there's a sense of the Z sorting, which is how do you sort those squares that are kind of in the same region, but you need to kind of see them, so one has to go on top of the other. How do you handle that? Now, of course, through the I guess the filtering of the search box, that can overcome kind of obfuscation there, but that's clearly a challenge. What's the idea of the coloured axis lines? How's that sort of derived?
I did that because I wanted to emphasize that we're not plotting the values of these two variables, we're plotting the ranking. And so what I wanted someone to be able to do is to scan across, say, that very top row. And what you can see is that there's a lot of, say, IT and science and research clusters. They tend to be on the right-hand side because demand for them tends to be growing a little bit more quickly. And if you were to scan kind of down, like the vertical, then again you see a lot of those IT clusters are near the top. So you can see that they're paid relatively well compared to other skill clusters. So that's why I did that. Initially, it was much, much larger. That was almost the dominant feature, was the border. But it was just a bit much on the eye, I think. So it became a bit more subtle as we as I kind of developed it.
Yeah, it makes sense. I guess there was also a point where you thought, should I tell people what these colours mean? Do I need to include a colour legend, or have they already got it? And I guess you probably went for the safety first option, which is let me remind you what these colours are.
Oh, no, I think you've got to remind people, right? Because in fact, if you scroll up, it's quite a while since I've kind of mentioned those names. So no, I wouldn't expect people to remember those. And you mentioned previously the ordering of the boxes. The data's sorted by the total demand for the skill, so that I didn't end up in that situation where you've got kind
Right.
of very small boxes obscured by larger ones.
Oh yes, of course. Yeah, that would make sense. Um, Again, in a spatial dimension, you've obviously mentioned that it was bigger, and I guess this could have been a centerpiece. And I think it's a really worthwhile piece of analysis to do, which is to almost sort of bring the two perspectives together into this sort of relationship. Because when we talk about these regions on the plot, the fact that you indicate those commentaries, this corner means high growth, high salary. So if you're in here, don't worry about the specific are you more than that thing. It's if you're in
No,
here, that's the characteristic,
exactly.
and it's reduced. Sorry, it's not. Well, yeah, it is reduced, but not in a negative way. It's reduced the language that we think of as everyday people. This is a growing job area or skill demand, and I might make more money in that area. So I think it makes sense to elevate it to that sort of commentary as well.
And actually, it's affected the way that we present it. So, when I've come to give PowerPoint presentations, for example, I just show those two corners of the chart.
Right.
Perhaps to begin with, I might show a small version of the whole chart, but it's very hard to see on one PowerPoint slide. You're never going to be able to kind of just leave it like that. So then I follow that up with two slides. One has a snapshot of the top right-hand corner, and the other has a snapshot of the lower left-hand corner. And I just focus on those two corners, and again just focus on kind of broadly describing the skills that live in those two areas. And I think that's the kind of the main takeaway from the chart.
And just the last question about this: did you try, for example, circles or bubbles? How did you kind of land on the rounded rectangle as the method to show the placeholder, but also the size variation?
That was just because I'd used rectangles to show the bar chart in the taxonomy, and rectangles to show the value of different skills, and so I just wanted to keep it kind of to keep some consistency there, I
Yeah.
guess. Yeah.
And actually, no, the last point. When you do the interactive search, there's a really nice sort of pulsing bubble that kind of comes in
Oh,
to draw your
that's right.
attention.
Yeah.
How did that? How did it end up with that then? What kind of iterations did you go through there?
So at first, when I did it, I noticed that it was tricky to see the results of the query that you typed in. And so I just wanted to make sure that people could quickly spot the skill clusters um, there. And so that's why I decided on there's a little pulsing circle that emerges when you press enter. Um, I think if I was doing it again, I would also fade out the skill clusters that aren't relevant. I think I was looking at it the other day. I think they still stay as they are, but if I was doing that again, I would fade out those kind of non-relevant
Ah,
skill
so
clusters.
kind of go both
Um,
ways. Emphasize what you've
yeah,
selected and
exactly. Emphasize
relegate.
what I want to show and kind of de-emphasize
Yeah,
everything
yeah,
else.
yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, fantastic. You know, I think it's really kind of novel way to show that complicated data in a very appealing way.
Yeah.
The last thing about the piece overall is yes, there's text, and sometimes we forget about the demands of writing text. Now, I just wondered, as we kind of scroll through the content, what kind of process did you go through to edit that text, and when did you find? Perhaps were there occasions when you found that we're writing too much here, or we're writing too little? We need to add more context, more explanations. What were the kind of process you went through for the writing side?
So the way that I write is, I guess you've got to make sure that you've got a really strong purpose. Like you need to know why you're telling people about this kind of research, what you want them to take out of it, um, and then I'll never just write. I typically start with headings, then I'll move to bullet points, and only then once I'm sure that I've got a real flow to the piece, that each piece follows like each paragraph follows logically on, then I'll kind of flesh it out into sentences. We also, I haven't mentioned it, but I always show my data visualizations and articles to lots of other people just so that they can read it through and because as a researcher you can become used to like acronyms or terms, and you can become a bit too familiar with it all, and so it's helpful to have a kind of a fresh pair of eyes on both the text and the visualizations.
Yeah, and sometimes, although it's not something I ever do, but it's something I kind of like to preach about the prospect of doing. I think sometimes writing the text commentaries, the captions, the headings, even the titles, can be a really good way for you to really get into the zone of who your audience is and what level of content you should be pitching this at. Not making assumptions of prior knowledge for acronyms or
No.
technical terms, but also not dumbing it down into such a blunt, sort of noddy language that makes it just so difficult to wade through as a as a sophisticated audience. So I think that's a good practice to get into, and clearly there's a spatial take up of text, but I think when you do read through the project, it makes a lot of sense to set this up, and then we move on to the visualization to expand further. So it's a very well judged feature on this.
Oh, thank you.
Just to close off then, so as you kind of now reflect on this, I mean, obviously you were kind of clear from the outset the kind of technologies you were going to work on, but as you reflect on the overall process and your workflow and your own experience, the efficiency, the enjoyment, the things that you do differently, you've touched on a few little small features, but in a broader sense, how do you now reflect on this, and has it worked? Has it succeeded? How have you measured its impact?
Yeah, so I guess we can measure the impact very directly in terms of the number of views that we've had, and we've been very lucky in that respect. So since it was published, this is the second most read blog on our website, which we would have never expected given the content. As we keep saying, it's a skills taxonomy. We really didn't anticipate that at all. And the number of inquiries that we've had, and it has led to more collaboration. So we're just about to start a project this year with the JP Morgan Chase Foundation that will look at the demographics of those who are affected by automation, and will aim to provide very kind of concrete recommendations about transition paths that those people who are at risk can take to move into kind of safer occupations. So that's one project that's come out of it. I loved doing the project. I mean, I really do love data visualization. I think it's just a fantastic puzzle almost, isn't it? You've got your set of pre-attentive features and you've got your set of data insights, and it's a matter of matching one up with the other, and that's just a really interesting puzzle to have to kind of contend with. In terms of improvements or what I would do differently, there are obviously the small things. I think I've touched on some of them, and I think I could go back to any data visualization and kind of still make lots of changes. And in some ways that's good, because I think it shows that you're improving, hopefully.
Yeah, and I think there's a key distinction between finished and complete.
Yes.
We never complete these. We just stop doing them because
That's
the
true.
time is run out. We don't have the time. We don't have the space to give anymore at that point. But as you say, once you get that distance from it, there are new ideas come up, new techniques, new
That's really
skills, as
true.
you've talked about with the responsiveness. So
Yeah.
it's something
And
that
I
can
think,
live on.
yeah, exactly. More broadly, I guess, as I was reflecting on the questions that you sent through, I think if I had an unlimited budget, there are kind of two aspects that I'd like to kind of incorporate more within this type of work. The first is using a greater range of communication methods, so not just text and D3 visualizations or WebGL, but what I really admire in the major newspapers and magazines is their use of illustration and animation and video, and particularly when they're really well blended with the text, and where they're appropriate. And I think it can really help bring a story to life. So I'd love to be able to do something like that. And then the other feature would be introducing the story of an individual or a group who are affected by your research. If I think back on the data visualizations by others that have really stuck in my mind, there are always ones that are told that they kind of focus on an individual or group, and then they use data visualization to describe that person's world. And I think that's really powerful. So I'd love to be able to do something like
Yeah.
that. But that does require more resources.
Yeah, absolutely. No, the kind of idea of a first-person narrative, I think, does bring some sort of
Exactly.
humanity to these otherwise
Totally.
relatively abstracted figures sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, listen, Kath, that's been absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your insights about all the backstory and behind the scenes, hidden thinking to that project. It's been a pleasure to chat with you about it. Thank you to everyone who's tuned in for this episode. Join us soon for another episode of Explore Explain.
To see more information about today's episode, including links to the key sites and resources mentioned, visit my website at visualizingdata.com. You'll also find details about my book, information about my public and private training courses, as well as over a decade of blog posts. If you've enjoyed this series, please consider liking, subscribing and spreading the word. See you next time. Explore Explain is a Matt Notes interactive production.